On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian lobby just so we can get our head around the politics, things that are on the political agenda that are of specific interest to Christians for this coming week. And Wendy Francis, National Director of Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby, back with us. Hi, Wendy. Welcome back to 2020.
Neil, it's always so good to talk to you. Thank you for having us.
Wendy, let's start with one that, this one plays with your head a little bit, I suspect, and it's in the issue around New South Wales conversion laws because over the weekend, the New South Wales opposition leader, so the Labor leader, Chris Minns, announced on the weekend that he would ban conversion practices if elected. Give us your insights in here as to what's happened.
It's really interesting you say this plays with your head because I think that's exactly right. Because right from the outset, I would have to say ACL, and I know that you as well, we would be opposed to all coercive conversion practices. So if people think to themselves conversion practices, we're thinking of, shock therapy or brainwashing treatment, that sort of thing, that is already unlawful. And of course we would be opposed to that. But there is no evidence of this happening in New South Wales or indeed around Australia. But what our concern is, I guess, is that the real objective is to do a Victorian-style election, policy, which is in Victoria, they outlaw even consensual counselling and prayer. They even outlaw in Victoria, so it's a criminal offence for a parent to have a conversation with a child, trying to stop them from wanting to transition to a transgender identity. So this is what our concern is. But when people say, conversion therapy, what comes to mind is something horrendous that does not happen and is already unlawful. So, we need to, that's why I think it plays with people's head a bit.
So all of the same issues are in play, and to be fair, this is on both sides, isn't it? This is the Liberal Party in New South Wales as well as the Labor Party in New South Wales. All seem to be supporting these sorts of bans that would outlaw churches, even doing, as you say, consensual counselling. Even people in a prayer line, as I understand it, could be, in the firing line here. But those parental conversations around a dinner table, or things that are going pear-shaped in a family, and parents can't even have the right to talk to their own kids. This is the sort of thing that that you're talking about here. That we need to get our head around and understand, how to make sense of what's being said.
Correct. So with the Labor Party, Chris Minns came out with this is what we'll do if we're elected, and very quickly Perrottet jumped on board and said, oh yes, we'll introduce these laws as well. So what we really need to do is to make sure that we're part of that conversation, because we need to make sure that they understand if they try and bring in a Victorian-style legislation, which is also what is happening in Tasmania, we will push back. And when I'm saying we, I'm not just meaning ACL. We need to be, as a people of God, pushing back on this, because when you look at the Victorian law, I need to make this really clear. The Victorian law does not simply make electroshock or brainwashing sort of treatments unlawful. Its wording is broad enough to ban, it bans counselling from a pastor or a Christian counsellor, or, as you say, even a parent advising someone, even that sex outside of man-woman marriage is sinful. They wouldn't even be able to say that. It would be unlawful to talk to anybody in terms of resisting any sort of temptation that we would see was outside God's parameters. But it also, the Victorian legislation explicitly says that it applies to carrying out a religious practice, including prayer. So this is an incredibly concerning development in New South Wales. What we're talking about is people who are asking for prayer and not being able to get it because of the criminal penalty attached there.
And when people want help, oftentimes they'll turn to their local church, or they'll be referred to someone within a church who has their head around these sorts of issues. But criminalising the church around these issues is very challenging. And as you say, there's already some significant things in play in Victoria, and it is already on the agenda for both sides, no matter what the outcome of the New South Wales state election. So it doesn't leave a whole lot of hope there for there being some level of freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of speech in New South Wales to be able to continue, Wendy. And let me just to throw this in here for your impression, Wendy Francis. It seems to be that Christians who are aware that something needs to be done, someone needs to speak up, our response is usually pretty poor, isn't it?
Well, I think people are concerned about their own well-being and their own safety, but this is really important because what we're talking about is children who are confused about their gender, and this is a very real occurrence. This is something that is growing because of the sort of stuff we've got in our curriculum, and I think even what's happening in Tasmania with drag queens and stuff. This is the confusion over gender is something that is on the increase, and we are actually sacrificing our children if we are not prepared to speak up about this, because children need that sort of watchful waiting approach that is global best practice. That is certainly medical practitioners right across the board would say global best practice is a watchful waiting, not immediately putting your children onto some sort of hormone blockers when they're only 11 years old, followed by often other hormones that would help them to transition, and even surgical assistance to help them transition, which we know will never, ever end in a good result, because you cannot biologically change from one gender to another. It's actually impossible.
And Wendy, just to deepen this some more too, because some people might be thinking, oh, this is just another conspiracy theory. People being outspoken saying that our freedoms are under threat, and really is there a true threat that's there? Because, hey, aren't these laws in force in Victoria, and, people aren't being imprisoned? But the thought here that, you could say, is this some sort of conspiracy theory? As you pointed out, there are no evidence for any of those conversion practices, the shock treatment and such things happening anywhere. So you only have to boil it down and you recognise that this is aimed at Christians. It's aimed at the church. That is a concern, isn't it?
It's a huge concern, because if a church or even any practitioner was using the sort of electroshock or brainwashing treatments, then I actually have to say that churches were never the main culprit for this. We go back and look at counselling sessions that did use this. Of course, that's not right, and that is not happening. If it was happening, then we could go to the police about that. It is unlawful. Those treatments are unlawful already. So we've got to say, okay, what is the main target here? And you have to look at faith-based groups, because the legislation explicitly says that it applies to carrying out a religious practice, including but not limited to a prayer-based practice. So prayer is actually in the firing gun here. And if we can't pray for somebody, then we have no religious freedom at all in our nation.
And it is hurting the people it's designed to protect, because if you can't seek help, if you can't go to your doctor and expect your doctor will tell you the truth, you're the one who's being hurt. It doesn't necessarily affect or hurt Christians if we are, saying, no, we can't talk to you about that. The people who are seeking the help are the ones who are being hurt, aren't they?
It's the children. It always comes back to the children for me, Neil, and I know that adults are also being hurt. But young children are never, you can't say that a child can't be easily affected by the sort of curriculum that they're seeing. We can't say that a child's not going to be confused during puberty. What child is not confused during puberty? So what they need is somebody to walk alongside them, to be truthful with them, to love them, to see them through to the other side, not to immediately say, well, the only thing we can do here, the only legal avenue for a child who's confused in Victoria is to affirm them in their confusion. That is the only legal pathway. And this is what New South Wales are looking to emulate, and we are just going to push back as much as we possibly can, because this is just too important.
Wendy, there's a state election coming up in New South Wales, and you've got both sides, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, both saying they'll want to ban conversion practices. And as you say, those things are already outlawed. The way you think of those dreadful physical effect practices, but the target is the Christian church. What's the answer, Wendy Francis? How should we be thinking? Candidates that we vote for? What sort of action can you take? Should you be in touch with your MPs and candidates at this time? This is an important time, isn't it, in the lead up to an election?
It really is. Election is the one time that you can be very sure that the candidates are listening, the government is listening. And so we need people to contact their local MPs. We need people to contact both leaders and say that they do not want parental rights being removed from them to be able to talk to their children who are confused about their gender. We do not want consensual counselling and prayer and parental conversations to be made criminal. This is an incursion into parental rights. It is a complete switch around between church and state. Like we're saying, we want church and state to be separate, and this is the state telling not just the church, but parents how they are to be able to talk to their children. So yes, Neil, we really encourage people. Contact all of your candidates, ask them how they would vote if this sort of legislation was put in. Contact the two leaders of the parties, contact existing MPs, and stay in touch with ACL, because we're doing a number of different campaigns in this sort of area. So stay in touch with us as well. In the lead up to the election, we're wanting to make sure that we do some interviews with people who are really trying to push back on this as well. So I encourage people to stay in touch.
Okay, let's move on. There's a bunch of other things happening, and something, I guess, good to talk about. The Walk for Life in Adelaide on Saturday. First of what will be a whole bunch of pro-life walks or marches in various capital cities through the year ahead. How did things go on Saturday?
Look, it was really good. There was over 2,000 who gathered in Adelaide. They're just around Parliament House. Pennington Gardens, they walked around Parliament House. And so there were a number of MPs there as well. I know that Senator Alex Antic was there. The Honourable Sarah Game was there. Martin Niles spoke as well. But when you look at the crowd, and I wasn't there, but I looked at the pictures, and there's just no doubt that we are witnessing the emergence of an absolute new pro-life generation, because these younger generations, they know the humanity of the unborn, because on Facebook they see the first photo of a baby is in the mum's womb. They see it. I see these pictures. So there's no, it's impossible for this generation to sort of buy the lie that an unborn baby is nothing. It's just a clump of cells. So they know this. So what we're seeing is a really big encouragement, because a young generation is actually rising up, and they are the ones now campaigning on behalf of the unborn. And so that's a wonderful thing. There are a couple of really good initiatives at the moment in both federal parliament, but also then in South Australian Parliament. The Born Alive bill is being sponsored by Alex Antic and Matt Canavan, but there's also a bill in South Australia by Sarah Game, who she wants to see criminals who commit offences against pregnant women and the baby actually dies. She wants to see the baby recognised as well as the violence against the woman. So that's a good bill too. But this Born Alive bill is something that every single one of our listeners can have a say in. There's a petition on our website, the ACL website. But, if you just even Google Born Alive bill and Matt Canavan, you'll find different ways that you can support that bill.
Tell me, Wendy, if you know, because these days, and it's usually an estimate, but the number of babies' lives that are terminated annually in Australia, is there a number that the ACL works with? Because, we sometimes hear different numbers, and whatever number you use, it's usually a horrendously high number. But what's the number that you tend to work with when someone says how many babies are aborted in Australia each year?
So we always work with a conservative number, because we want to be careful not to conflate these numbers. So if you go to any of the pro-choice websites and you look for the statistics, consistently you will see that it's around 100,000. So I think that's a conservative figure. I think it's probably more than that, particularly now that we have an abortion pill that people can take, which is hard to monitor and hard to get statistics from. But we're talking 100,000 babies, 100,000 little Australians being terminated annually in Australia. And certainly, if anybody thinks of 100,000 lives being lost every year, you'd have to say it makes it one of the most important human rights issues of our day.
There's lots more to talk about, and we'll monitor things along through the year, especially on a Monday when we're talking to the Australian Christian Lobby, very interested in how the abortion debate continues in Australia and the growth of a pro-life movement. As you say, we ought to be very excited about that, Wendy Francis, that there is a new emerging generation of young people who are taking up the challenge to fight for unborn children. Just quickly, time's almost running out. The Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry into Christian schools. Is there something we ought to know that's continuing to hit the headlines or not hit the headlines as they should?
Yeah, so the Australian Law Reform Commission, so most people talk ALRC, so that's what I'll say for the point of the time. So the ALRC recommendation to the government now that has come out in a discussion paper would actually, if it was followed to the letter, it would really see the end of Christian schools, religious schools in our nation. So what the ALRC is recommending is that Christian schools would not be able to employ somebody, or they would not either be able to really make the ethos of the school completely Christian. So they would have to, alongside teaching Christian beliefs on sexuality and gender, they have to teach ideas that are completely opposite to Christian views on sexuality and gender. And so, yeah, we're trying to help people contribute to this discussion paper. There's a survey that is on the website, and the government website, the ALRC website. So we're trying to help coach people on how best to answer that survey. But also there's calls for submissions, and people can write a submission as well. But, this is an issue that really hits home to a lot of Australians, and not just religious Australians. There are many Australians who want their children to go to a Christian school because of the ethos that is there. And this would be completely, the right for parents to send their children to a Christian school would be removed if the ALRC had their way.
As you say, it could spell the end of Christian schooling in Australia as we know it. And Wendy, webinars are a great way to get a little more depth. I feel like sometimes we're just touching and scratching the surface when we get an update each week on these things and the ALRC recommendations. Let's talk about a webinar or two you've got coming up. If people are participating in those, what sort of things would they expect to hear? How long do they go, the webinars? And what sort of person is likely to respond?
That's great. Thank you, Neil, for that. This Wednesday and Thursday night in the evening, depending on where you are in Australia, but 7 or 7:30, where it'll be an hour and a half max. I'm always pretty good on timing. So an hour and a half. And what we're going to do is actually walk through the survey and explain what the questions actually mean, and allow people during that time to fill out the survey while they're online. And we will give like 3 or 4 minutes for each question for people to go away and actually fill it out and then come back and still listen. So it'll be on the whole time. So it won't be an intrusive thing into their evening, but it will be an assistance to people to be able to actually do this survey. It's such an important thing for the good news stories to get out there, because we know that there are many people who are pushing very hard for the end to Christian schooling. And whether or not you yourself have been involved in Christian schools, we have to say that this is a really important way of salt and light in our nation for the children who are attending Christian schools, many of whom are not necessarily believers themselves, but who are seeking that sort of ethos to be able to soak up in their early days of life. So it's an important thing for every Australian, certainly for Christian Australians, and we would love people to, you just go to the ACL website and you can get the link to actually attend that Wednesday and Thursday nights.
Well, I know there's a lot of people. We get to the end of a segment where we talk about these things that are really challenging on the agenda politically, what affects Christians, what affects the freedom of Christian schools, the freedom of churches to be able to teach what the Bible teaches, these things under threat. And so for listeners who want to participate in that sort of webinar and find out how you can actually take some action, lots of action you can take, as we mentioned when we were talking about those conversion laws, but around this one, very, very important. The ACL website is acl.org.au, Australian Christian Lobby, and you'll find a link there for that Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry and how you can join in those webinars, how you can participate in that survey. So the website, easiest one to remember ever, acl.org.au. Wendy Francis, National Director of Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby. Wendy, thanks so much for a great update once again today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil, very much. Thank you to you and your listeners.